Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast of the United States on August 29 in 2005. The storm flooded nearly 80% of the city of New Orleans. The damages caused by the storm are estimated to be above $100 billion. Katrina left more than 42,000 refugees and cost nearly 2,000 lives. More than 10 years after the disaster, the region is still recovering from the storm.
So how do you rebuild from such a disaster? Well, you don't. Not exactly. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So why rebuild exactly the same way? You take this as an opportunity to redesign. This is a chance to not only rebuild new infrastructures, but to also innovate in many different fields and make the city a better place than it was before. So what does this new New Orleans look like?
We have identified 3 areas for brand spanking new New Orleans: mitigate, respond, and connect.
Multiple lines of defense. A final consideration concerning itself the catastrophe that was Katrina is how built capital should facilitate natural processes. The controlling of an environmental process is an extremely tricky thing. Irrespective of whatever engineering solution we decide upon, if the forces of the world exceed the power of our design will ultimately fail. For these reasons, it makes sense to build around and better manage a natural process. Hydraulic processes are an excellent example of this, which are particularly relevant in the context of New Orleans. Future design that accommodates and builds around water's tacit desire to flow as an alternative to the outright stopping of it through the utilization of abrupt boundaries and leading it to drain out of harm's way is another preemptive consideration in the managing of future floods.
Ecological solutions and the recreation of natural capital has the potential to protect against future hurricane disasters. Again, looking to the New Orleans as an example, restoration of wetlands and barriers islands of the southeastern coast of Louisiana would inherently act as a shield to the storm. So, soft engineering techniques combined with the rebuilding of the natural capital preemptively alleviate much of the stress on the building capital, such as seawalls and levees.
The traditional approach for designing city defences against hurricanes is to create large seawalls and levees. This approach results in cities like New Orleans having only one line of defence against one of nature's most powerful displays. What if rather than one line of defence, we had multiple? What if we redesigned our defences to start diminishing a hurricane's power kilometres away from that first seawall, and for the final line of defence to be right at your doorstep? The first line of defence would require the revitalisation and maintenance of coastal ecosystems in the area, which provide a natural hurricane buffer zone. The levees and seawalls would remain to provide a second line of defence, hopefully preventing any remaining storm surge from making it into the city. If these 2 first measures were still inadequate, the final defence would be the redesigning of the city's hydraulic processes by integrating natural capital into the built capital in order to reduce the damage caused by the floodwater within the city.
Warning.
Education of average citizen.
What if we can improve the overall warning and evacuation system to meet the needs of all citizens? After Katrina hit, work had been done to develop a city-assisted evacuation program, which targets those who lack the transportation and needed special needs services. This directly combats the issues with non-evacuated residents, which in the case of Katrina would have had no choice but to stay in their homes. Before Katrina hit, the idea was to use school buses to evacuate the main parts of the city. However, it didn't turn out as planned, as the area in which the buses were parked were flooded. In researching this new assisted evacuation program, it was evident that it was mainly only authorities that were communicating with researchers from universities. So we say for the future, why not involve the average citizens in developing the evacuation system? This improves the communication between the authorities and the affected residents, which is important for the education of the citizens and for the future will enable them to make informed decisions. Fiona will now talk a bit more about the education.
What if the education is easier to accept by average citizen? According to National Geographic, The mayor announced the evacuation notice 7 hours after the Katrina turning into Category 4. We know the levy was only supposed to defend Category 3 or less. Only 2 hours later, the Katrina turning into Category 5. What if people have a few more hours to evacuate? The traffic may not be that overloaded, and we have time to go back and pick up those who do not have transport. Another thing worthy to be mentioned is that we have quite a few New Orleans citizens choose vertical evacuation. Basically, it means they choose to move to a higher place and they think it is safe, but actually it is not. What if people have proper education ahead? What if someone told them it is not safe to move to a higher place during Category 5 hurricane? I even adopt whether people know where the shelter is when disaster like this happens. We have an example here. Japan has frequent natural disasters just like New Orleans. Let's say one daily education material from Japan. This is how governments show people where the water level is when certain category disaster happens. The sign is commonly seen in residential area, plus the cute cartoon expression. Both young children and old people would easily understood. However, we did not find any education material from New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina.
Enhancing social capital.
Following on from the other ideas you've heard, we're now here to talk to you about how social capital can help in rebuilding New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina was more than just a natural disaster, and we think that social factors really contributed to increased vulnerability and inhibited recovery due to a lack of socio-political and economic resources. The social and physical destruction of New Orleans further intensified the impact of the disaster for those in really economically vulnerable situations, with some people even going as far as to call it a non-natural disaster, which I think is really interesting and something I'd never considered before. So this kind of gave us the idea to think about social capital as a key element that can be used by residents to survive before, during and after a natural disaster. Looking forward, what if the social capital of New Orleans was built to 21st century standards? It could become a city with high standards for diversity, tolerance, fairness and justice. This wouldn't be an easy task and would require the participation of the entire community, but the benefits of doing so would ensure that the city becomes a sustainable one and a desirable place to live following Katrina.
As Mia mentioned, New Orleans has a long history of social issues, including racial segregation and wealth inequality. So following the destruction that Hurricane Katrina caused, I'm sure it's no surprise to hear that some of the neighbourhoods were able to bounce back faster than others. However, what might be surprising to hear from that is that their recovery was not necessarily just reliant on individual resources and affluence, but rather the strength of the community's social capital. One area which really stood out in their solidarity and rapid rebuilding was the Vietnamese and Vietnamese American community, and by 2007 over 90% of their residents had returned. Rather than waiting for the city to provide social services, the community self-organised before returning, dividing up responsibilities and ensuring that they would be self-sufficient upon their return. The bonding, bridging and linking social capital in the area allowed residents to not only coordinate their rebuilding processes internally, but to ensure that their voices were heard by the city government and other relevant institutions. The residents rebuilt most of the community's single-family homes, shut down an unsafe landfill, began developments on urban farms, with a new health centre and charter school already being planned. This example shows just how powerful strong social links can be. They weren't necessarily the most wealthy community, but they were able to use their social capital connections and rebuild faster. This example also shows how people are more likely to return back to their neighbourhoods if they know that they're returning to a strong community, which is very important in the recovery from natural disasters. There's actually a volunteer organisation called Rebuilding Together New Orleans. Their goal is to revitalise and repair the neighbourhoods, which in turn would revitalise the New Orleans community. This form of social capital helps the process of bringing people together with the goal of establishing new social ties, new information and structures. This is another great example of fostering social capital and its potential benefits.
Social capital has a lot of different facets to it, and one of those major foundations of it is trust. So without trust in the community, there is no social capital. So within smaller communities, it is a lot easier to build the trust because you know who your neighbours are, you know the roads around you, and that trust is very, very easy to build over a small amount of time. With Hurricane Katrina and the rebuilding of the cities, these local communities and districts were able to rebuild their trust very quickly. Integrating this with the larger community of New Orleans is a much difficult task because of the amount of people and the sheer size of it. Furthermore, this social capital has to expand between linking New Orleans with the wider American community. At the moment, knowing that New Orleans had been destructed by Hurricane Katrina, it was difficult to reconnect the whole American trust with New Orleans. This really links to a facet of social capital, which is bridging and bonding social capital. So bonding social capital is within your smaller community, linking district to district, district to district. Bridging social capital is bridging the gap between racial classes, social classes, and then just location. It is easy to bridge this within New Orleans because of its location, but linking in governments and wider communities will really help build the social capital of New Orleans, and without this, there is no hope of building social capital of this community back from where it was after Hurricane Katrina to the future. And that's ideally what we want, not just to get it what it was, but into the 21st century levels.